One last thing I'll just say about George Bailey's ear infection is that it does mention, it's easy to miss, that he never went to World War II later when they're grown up. He can't be enlisted in the services because he's got one ear doesn't work and you're just not allowed in the services in those days.
He fought the Battle of Bedford Falls was quite the line. He was a maligned air raid siren warden. He was doing rubber, paper and scrap drives. He was making sure that people got all their rations. So he was head of the town, redistributing, doing things which were very important. But I think as a man, not transporting myself back to that time necessarily because that was a generation so far removed from me, it's very difficult to properly feel that sentiment, you know. But I think as a man, if there were another draft now, even if it were like the First World War, which is totally unnecessary in many respects, and you're not doing a grand moral cause like the Americans felt they were conscripted into, you know, fighting fascism abroad and preventing the Japanese from taking our country, this sort of stuff. Even if that were the cause, you would still feel impotent or in a way morally castrated if you couldn't participate in many respects. And I think, you know, I had bad asthma as a kid. I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons I could be disbarred from frontline service were there a draft to come around. But even if you are doing something important, instrumental at home, while everyone you know and your brother is going over there, is putting the physical effort in and putting their lives on the line and being commended for acts of valour, you would feel, even if you're doing something important, a little bit left out and like you weren't good enough. It would feel an internal sense of guilt, even if you were instrumental to the war effort at home.
Yeah, and it's one more opportunity where George Bailey doesn't get the adventure he so much craves.
Yes.
I know it's a bit odd to perhaps call World War II or the War in the Pacific as an adventure.
That is how it was seen in many respects.
Yeah, and he wanted to see the world a bit. And so he's denied again for like the fourth or fifth time in his life, whatever it was, because of his ear, because of the sacrifice he'd already made. But yeah, I mean, because a broad point here, but James Stewart or Jimmy Stewart is your classic everyman, isn't he? He's your classic everyman in nearly every film he ever was in, and nearly always as well a goodie. Sort of, you're supposed to not only sympathise with him, you almost can't fail to.
Yes.
You just do sympathise with Jimmy Stewart in every film he's in, and so here, although you could argue it's laid on a little bit thick. I wouldn't, but you could. People have. It's done really well, and he's just obviously just such a good guy. I mean, do you think it's going too far to say there are parallels with Christ, with the sacrifices he's making? That he sacrifices his whole life many times for others, for everyone else, basically.
I wouldn't say it's going too far, particularly when Christ is crucified. The suffering is so extreme, there is a point where he induces nihilism in himself because he's being mocked by the robbers either side of him saying, oh, if you really are the Christ, you know, let yourself down. One of the other ones says, you know, leave off. He's being mobbed by the crowd. And there is a point where Jesus himself looks up to the heavens and goes, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's talking about himself because he is God incarnate, technically, if you're talking about the Trinity there.
Yeah.
So in the Christian conception. And if the suffering is so bad, you have disbelieved in yourself and you're capable of performing miracles up until the point of raising the dead, and eventually you know you're going to be raised anyway because you've prophesied it throughout the other Gospels, that must be an extreme level of suffering. And so it does take this man who is of an unimpeachable moral character, who's sacrificed all throughout his life, he experiences suffering to the point of where he is going to jump from a bridge and, in many respects, selfishly abscond the gifts he has been given on a local level with his wife and kids who are dependent on him. And it does take saving someone else, the prospect of universal salvation from Christ, or saving the person in front of him who's done something as silly as jump in the river like he was about to do, to then recommit his faith towards the goodness of the path he's on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to compare it to Christ. I don't know if it's an exact intended allegory because
no,
they
I didn't mean that.
Mention Christ either, as you brought up earlier. But
yeah,
there's something to be said about the noble sacrifice of man for others, and on a local level, that does speak to us. You know, we're meant to. If you're a Christian, you're meant to be called to imitate Christ's example, and that doesn't mean nail yourself on a big bit of wood, but it does mean make instrumental sacrifices to make sure that others who are worthy of your respect and protection flourish, and that's what George does as a father, as a member of the community. And I think as well, the reason we sympathise with Jimmy Stewart quite a lot is because he did actually do that war service. He's
Jimmy Stewart served in the war, didn't he?
He was evidently a patriotic American. He was a lifelong little government Republican. He stumped for Barry Goldwater. He stumped for Reagan at certain points. He stumped for Nixon. Yay. We all get one wrong, don't we? And then right before this came out, funnily enough, he recorded a radio show called We Hold These Truths, and it was to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. And it was aired on December the 15th, 1941. So it was recorded well before Pearl Harbor, but it came out 8 days after. And President Roosevelt, who I'm sure we'll be mentioning later in relation to Mr. Potter, he said, we definitely need to air this because of Pearl Harbor just happening. The entire broadcast is brilliantly patriotic. It even at one point has a little pastiche part where it's mentioning how gun rights are inextricable to the American experience.
Listen to this. Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
That mean you can keep your gun?
That means if somebody gets into office and turns sour on the people that put him there, why, he can't vex us with a standing army the way George did before the war. No, sir, we people of the states, if we got arms, nobody's going to order us to do things the majority of the country ain't voted for. Not without a fight.
Again, something which wouldn't be broadcast over the public access airways these days now. And it ends with FDR, rather ironically, addressing the public and saying that, well, in America, rights are given by God and inextricable from each person, but over in Germany, the rights are granted to you by the Nazi state, and you're only a citizen insofar as you serve the Nazi state. So that's why we must all be engaged in this grand project of eventually embroiling ourselves in when Pearl Harbor came along, because he had the foreknowledge of it happening, but at least supporting, at that time, the European war effort. And you get that a little bit now. They genuflect with claims of our democracy, and it is our values that mean we must support Ukraine, but there was a deep cynicism infected with that, because we know how the sausage is made. We know the money of the military-industrial complex. We don't really have as great a narrative to involve ourselves with. But Jimmy Stewart really believed in this. The Second World War did have a moral angle to it, which has cemented it in our minds as one of the great conflicts in history, and set apart from the First World War, for example, where there was a grand-scale tragic loss of life in many respects without cause. It was just a game of empires among some connected, related, and weirdly look-alike world leaders, of course. But Jimmy Stewart was always very proud of his war service. He was in the Air Force, I believe. He was even filming recruitment videos. There's a great recruitment video called, I think it's Earning Your Wings, where he's talking directly to potential Air Force recruits and saying, weirdly enough, the kind of things that George Bailey should have appreciated more are what you're going to get from being an aviation cadet. Like, they walk into a dance full of young girls and military brass, and some guy walks past with his Air Force wings, and suddenly all the girls drop all the army guys and walk over to them and start dancing with them. You know, it's that unapologetic, you're a man, you should be celebrated for your sacrifices attitude, which bleeds through It's a Wonderful Life, which bleeds through Stewart's career, which really makes you then and now resonate with the message and the performance he gives over, because he's a very sympathetic, clean-cut, all-American individual. You don't see a lot of that anymore.
I think it's really interesting that Jimmy Stewart was a Hollywood film star before the war.
Yes.
Chose to just serve during World War II and then came back. And in fact, this is the first film he shot after he came out of the services. And he was, I think I've seen it said somewhere that he was a little bit self-conscious that he might be a bit rusty, essentially, in front of the camera, which isn't the case, I don't think. But yeah, this thing that you, I mean, even Elvis went off and served in like Vietnam by that point, or Korea.
So did Jack Kirby and all of the Marvel Comics artists who created Captain America and the like. They actually went and fought.
Right. So loads of people during World War II, anyway. If you're rich and famous, it didn't really matter. You still answered the call. Again, it's a different world, isn't it? I can think of there was one American football player went and joined up for the first Iraq war. I can remember, but most rich and famous people in 2001 or something didn't drop their careers in order to join the services or anything. But yeah, it's a different world. The as you mentioned, the narrative that you really were fighting for freedom, the freedom of the world, the free world, against not just the Nazis but also the Japanese. authoritarian regime, and that you'd have like all sorts of war bonds. Everyone could do their bit. There's a bit in the film actually where they have like a rubber drive or something.
Yeah, that George is the leader of, and Uncle Billy, they turn the building and loan into a war bonds selling enterprise,
right? Yeah,
just to do their part.
So that I think if you didn't live through it, and if you haven't ever read anything about it or watched a documentary about it, it's easy to sort of forget. But the whole of America, or the whole world really, the whole world in a sense, was one way or another geared towards that conflict. It was a total war in all sorts of ways. Even though mainland America escaped it almost entirely, there's no Japanese bombing raids over the west coast. There's a couple of balloons, but anyway, I won't get into the detail of that. It's just, I think it's really interesting. Someone like Jimmy Stewart, already a famous Hollywood star, just dropped it all. And joined the services.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.